I'm Bob Mnookin, and I chair the program on negotiation here at Harvard. As many of you know, the program on negotiation is an inter-university consortium involving not just schools and departments here at Harvard, but also Brandeis, the Fletcher School at Tufts, and MIT. We are committed to improving the theory and practice of negotiation. I'd like to begin tonight with some thank yous. Thank you. I'm going to introduce our guests, but we've got three marvelous panelists, and I want to first thank them. I'm going to thank them several times tonight for coming this way and participating in this evening with us. Second, I would like to thank Shula Gilad, my PON colleague, who in fact is the entrepreneur that helped put this together. Polly Hamlin and Susan Hackley, the managing director, are part of the PON team that have provided tonight. It's better than pizza. There are finger sandwiches. I wouldn't have eaten dinner had I known what to expect, but we hope you all were able to get some food. Our topic tonight is an interesting one, and in some ways it couldn't be more timely. Why? Well, because in fact our title relates to what might be done to promote peace, more peace, some peace in the Middle East by means other than direct negotiations. I think it's the view of many of us here at the program on negotiation that have been working on different aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that the prospect for direct negotiations focused on final status issues are extraordinarily dim. My own thinking about why they're so dim really relates to three essential facts. The first is after what's called the Arab Spring, there's a great deal of turmoil in the countries around Israel and where the Palestinians are living in the West Bank and Gaza. Second, and even more to the point, in my view, there are profound internal conflicts that remain among Palestinians. Fatah and Hamas are no longer on the verge of civil war. But anyone that thinks soon there's going to be some united Palestinian front where there's agreement on one leader who really has the capacity among Palestinians to lead to a negotiated deal where the compromises that would be necessary are possible, I just don't see it on the Palestinian side. Nor do I see on the Israeli side that capacity. There's profound internal conflict within Israel. The structure of the Israeli government, which requires coalitions, it leads to coalitions that involve, I remember I heard an Israeli describe a meeting he had with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, where the Prime Minister said, well, why can't the Israeli parties do better in terms of within the government formulating policies that they can all agree on in various areas? To which the response was, I gather this is the first time in many years that the Conservative Party and the Liberals have had a coalition government. This was an acknowledgement that was true. He says, well, imagine if in fact you had to also have a coalition with Scottish nationalists, various other kinds of parties. Do you think that'd be pretty hard to manage? And in fact, within Israel, I think there are profound disagreements about almost every policy. Okay? Well, given that problem, I have to confess, and I haven't been asked, that if President Obama asked me, well, is this now a time when the President of the United States should commit his prestige to a very aggressive attempt to move within the next year the peace process forward, I would say, no, I don't think it's a very good time. That in fact, I think American involvement is going to be indispensable, but I don't personally see much prospect in the short run for serious final status negotiations that are going to lead anywhere. Well, thus, our topic tonight, what could be done in the meantime that might be constructive? What in terms of either Track 2 initiatives or other activities that are encouraged and supported by third parties might be useful? It was as if Dennis Ross had read about this program. I think many of you saw on Sunday his, which I thought was quite an excellent op-ed. First paragraph of which said essentially, now's not the time to push for final status agreement, but there are unilateral initiatives that each side could take that could be constructive, and he listed some. And I assure you tonight, if our speakers don't speak to them, we'll press them on them. But that's kind of the motivation for tonight, and I wanted to frame our conversation against that backdrop and describe explicitly what our thinking is. Now, we have on our panel tonight three people, all of whom have advised prime ministers or presidents on political and legal issues concerning negotiations having to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All have participated in direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians at a governmental level. Moreover, they've all participated in what are called Track 2 discussions as well. As many of you know, there has been a minor industry of Track 2 conversations involving Israelis and Palestinians during the last 20 years, some of which have been fruitful, regrettably none of which have really led to a resolution yet. We're going to draw on their experiences. Tonight's event, I want to alert everyone, is being taped. And I guess PON may put it up on its web. So you should keep that in mind. And what I want to do without further ado is introduce our three panelists. What I've asked each to do is initially give us about a 10-minute presentation. And then after those 30 minutes, what I'll ask is that they have an opportunity to question each other. I may toss in a few questions as well. And then finally, most importantly, we want to open it up to all of you so that you can ask questions as well. Let me introduce our three panelists. To my right is Ambassador Dore Gold. Ambassador Gold was the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations from 1997 through 1999. He was a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu during his first term as prime minister, and in fact was very involved in the Wye River negotiations involving Israel and the Palestinian Authority during the first Netanyahu term. He has negotiated on behalf of Israel in both direct and Track 2 negotiations. And he's been an advisor to the Israeli delegation to the Madrid Peace Conference. It might interest you to know that we gave our great negotiator award last year to former Secretary of State James Baker. And while we focused primarily on Berlin and taking down the wall and his activities there, we also did focus on his work with respect to Madrid. Today, he continues to be a close advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. To my left is Ambassador Alan Baker. Ambassador Baker is an expert on public international law, and during his 35-year period of governmental service was directly involved in Middle East peace negotiations and the drafting of various peace treaties and other agreements between Israel and its neighbors. He too, for 4 years, was an ambassador to Canada, and he served as legal counsel and deputy general counsel of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs between 1996 and 2004. Earlier in the 80s, he was seconded to the UN Headquarters Office of Legal Affairs as a senior legal advisor at the United Nations. And since 1989, Ambassador Baker has served as one of the Israeli members of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. He is currently at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which is led by Ambassador Gold. Our third guest is Ghaith al-Omari, who has served in various positions with the Palestinian Authority, including Director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President, and advisor to Mahmoud Abbas when he was Prime Minister. In these capacities, he provided advice on foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis the United States and Israel, and security. He's had extensive experience in the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, having been an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team throughout the permanent status negotiations between 1999 and 2001. He's participated in various negotiating rounds, most notably the Camp David Summit and the Taba Talks. So he was involved in the last attempt to negotiate final status issues. After the breakdown of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative, which many here in the room know about, an unofficial model peace agreement negotiated between leading Palestinian and Israeli public figures. He's currently executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine, the newsletter of which I want to commend to all of you. I read it regularly, and it's extraordinarily valuable. Please join me in giving our three guests a big round of applause. Ambassador Gold, do you want to start us off?
Okay. Let me begin with an experience I had a few years ago when I was invited to a conference run by UCLA outside of Athens. The conference continues to convene, although it's now moved to Prague in the Czech Republic. I had arrived to this conference run by Professor Steven Spiegel of UCLA, in which 200-300 Middle East experts convened from all over the Arab world, from Israel, from the United States, European countries. And as I walk into the hotel off a very early morning flight from Tel Aviv, Professor Spiegel says to me, "Dore, you're going to open the conference in the opening session along with Mohammed Dahlan." And I have about 15 minutes to get ready and to think about, okay, what's going to be the direction of my talk? Now, there's a temptation when you're an Israeli and you're set up with a Palestinian former minister or head of, in this case, the preventive security forces in the Gaza Strip, to automatically go into CNN debate mode. But I immediately understood that if I did that, I would lose my audience, that this doesn't work anymore. People are tired of this. So actually, as I got up to speak, I somewhat surprised the audience, because I said to Mohammed Dakhlan, you know, Mohammed, I want to tell you something. I very much admire something you did. Everyone looks at me like, what happened? And then I say, do you remember at the end of the Taba talks, Israel's foreign minister at the time, Shlomo Ben Ami, came out from these discussions. I think they pre-negotiated what he said. But what he said to a Israeli Kol Yisrael, that's our Voice of Israel reporter on the radio, which I heard in a cab going from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he said, we've never been so close to reaching a deal. Never were we so close. And he gave you the sense that if they had another 2 weeks to negotiate, it would have been closed, finished. So the Israeli reporter from Kol Yisrael had the decency to look for a Palestinian response. Not just to hear the Israeli side, but also hear the Palestinian side. And what did Mohammed Dakhlan say? He used a slang which has Aramaic origins, but is now used in Hebrew and has been picked up among Arabic speakers as well. He said, Charta Barta, which means anywhere from nonsense to BS. But Dakhlan's comment was extremely important because actually at the time, a whole cottage industry emerged in Washington and various other places that basically picked up Ben Ami's line. We've never been so close, just another 2 weeks, you know, a little elbow grease, and we can all have our Nobel Prizes. And when I said this to Dakhlan, he became very animated. He said, yes, it's true. Because from Taba, I went to the Rais, I went to Ramallah, and I told Arafat, Charta Barta. And then Arafat said to me, go to Mubarak, go to Cairo, tell him what happened. And he said the same thing. It's not true, the gaps are very wide, Charta Barta. And by the way, what also authenticated this version of events was the European Union's envoy to the Middle East, Ambassador Moratinos, who wrote up a summary which was later published by Kiva Eldar in Haaretz, who also basically said the gaps were too wide virtually in every field. Now, why am I starting with this discussion? Because part of what you have to do when you're a negotiator, you have to report to your prime minister, is you have to give a very accurate picture of the negotiating situation. You can't give a picture of what you want, of your political opinion. You have to give what your understanding is, and you have to justify it of the actual situation between, in this case, Israel and the Palestinians. Now, why is it that the situation between Israel and the Palestinians was so misunderstood? Why did people buy into this notion that we were just a few weeks away from a final status deal? Some of it comes from misunderstanding certain back-channel negotiations, because back-channels can be useful, and I'll mention that in a few minutes, but sometimes they can lead to misinterpretation. There was a famous negotiation in 1995, which later was called the Balin-Abu Mazen Agreement. And if you read Dennis Ross's book, the impression one gains is that the Balin-Abu Mazen Agreement gave him the hope to go to Camp David and push this whole concept through. But was there a Balin-Abu Mazen Agreement? I mean, people talked about it. Dan Margalit in the Israeli press spoke about the Balin-Abu Mazen Agreement. Tom Friedman in the New York Times op-eds talked about the Balin-Abu Mazen agreements. At one point, I was at the Erez Crossing for meetings with the Palestinians. I sat down alone with Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas. And I said, tell me, was there a Balin-Abu Mazen agreement? Did you actually reach an agreement? He said, I never signed it. I said, really? I mean, I had heard this from others, so it wasn't like I had to pretend I was surprised. But if you think this was all resolved, now one of the participants in those negotiations told me, Dore, we on the Palestinian side viewed this as a basis for further negotiations. That's how Arafat related to it. He didn't say it was a closed deal. But the myth spread from a back channel negotiation, which was incorrect, that basically the deal was done. And it wasn't true. Now, I'll share with you something else in back channels where sometimes they can be extremely useful. In the 1990s, I was invited by an American organization called Search for Common Ground to attend meetings in Europe with Arab counterparts. Some were Palestinian, some were Jordanian, some were from Saudi Arabia. And I would go virtually every 3 months. They must have had a lot of money for plane tickets. And after the Oslo Agreement was signed, I discerned from the Jordanian participants that there was some displeasure with what had happened, some doubts. And I utilized basically that position that I detected for offering Jordanian officers who were there. I said, if I bring you a letter from the head of the Israeli opposition, the head of the Likud, at the time was Benjamin Netanyahu, bring you a letter, would you pass it to King Hussein? They said yes. So I sat with the head of the opposition, we drafted a letter, I brought it to the next meeting in Athens. Athens is a very popular place, it's close by. And they passed it on. I got a call within 2 days, we agreed that an American living in Washington would be our intermediary for communication since there was no direct contact with Amman. And they told me to meet General Mohammed in a hotel in Istanbul. It sounded like a movie from Second World War period. I go to Istanbul, I meet General Mohammed, I get the response, I go back to Israel. I run to I keep calling Prime Minister. It was that time a member of Knesset, Netanyahu was home. We went over the letter. We drafted another letter. We took it to Morocco. It had a mistake in it, so we didn't pass it on. And then I get a call from our designated intermediary who sets up a conference call. This is back channel negotiation, sets up a conference call. So I can talk to Amman, Jordan, and General Mohammed's on the other side, and it's all run through Washington. I'm at a payphone on Rehov Palmach, on Palmach Street in Jerusalem. And across from the Pizza Mai. And the message is, General Mohammed comes on, and he says, Dore, would your boss like to meet my boss? I go, sure. London, day after tomorrow. So we work out the arrangement, and I fly with the head of the opposition, Mr. Netanyahu, to have a meeting with Jordanian leadership in the Hashemite brownstone in London. What came out of that meeting, and the meeting was actually with Hassan, who was the crown prince at the time, we made 2 commitments at that meeting. The first commitment was, we don't see Jordan as the alternative homeland for the Palestinians. Jordan is Palestine, is not the policy of the Likud party. And the second point we made was that if the Jordanians will sign a peace treaty with Yitzhak Rabin, our prime minister, the Likud will support it in Knesset, not like Oslo. The day after we were there, 2 representatives of Prime Minister Rabin came to the same brownstone, and the negotiations sprang forward, and we reached a peace arrangement with Jordan. So back channels in which people who are non-players like myself at the time can become extremely useful for setting up a peace breakthrough. So again, sometimes back channels can lead to misinterpretation, and sometimes they can lead to actual political breakthroughs. Now, I agree with Professor Mnookin that at presently, this is not the time for a major permanent status deal. Maybe later on I'll read you, there's Taufik Tirawi, was one of the heads of the security services, was interviewed by Nachum Barnea in Yediot Achronot on Friday, and basically says the same thing. And it's interesting to see the text of what Barnea quotes. So this isn't the time. So what do we do? One thesis is ratchet up external pressure on Israel. And there was a rumor floating around various circles about a month ago that the British Foreign Secretary, Mr. Haig, was planning a letter to be signed by 3 European foreign ministers to be sent to the incoming Secretary of State, Secretary of State Kerry, calling for Israel to accept certain parameters of a peace deal, and if it didn't accept them, it would face a harsh UN resolution against it. In my judgment, and from what I experienced with various back-channel contacts, had that gone through, as frozen as the situation is now, it would be Antarctica afterward. Because the basic dynamic that would be created was that the Palestinian side would then say, you know what? There's absolutely no reason for us to sit with the Israelis tomorrow, the day after, or next week, because Israel is going to be delivered to us on a silver platter. And would totally undermine any chance for negotiations, because I still believe in direct negotiations. What the history of the peace process has shown us is that the great breakthroughs between Israel and its Arab neighbors have come through direct contacts between us. Whether it was two men, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, who weren't particularly enamored with President Jimmy Carter's strategy for a Geneva Peace Conference, and they decided to make the breakthrough themselves. Whether it was the Oslo process itself, which began in Norway while the United States was sponsoring empty talks in Washington. Or whether it was our peace arrangements with Jordan, which emerged from direct Israeli-Jordanian contacts. That is the way to bring peace. That is the way to come forward, and not through some notion that Israel will be broken by by external pressure. Let me just touch on a last subject, which is unilateralism, which is tempting today for people to think about if negotiations don't seem to be possible. But there's a real caveat I have to introduce with the unilateralist idea. It's a tempting notion. I must say, it's very tempting that both sides sort of chart out what they want to do and maybe have coordinated unilateralism. Right. But our experience from the unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip was extremely negative. And I don't think people realize the extent to which unilateralism failed in the Israeli common memory. Unilateral, first of all, the withdrawal from Lebanon, and then second of all, with the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, there had been rocket fire against Israel prior to that withdrawal. But if you compare the number of rocket launches against Israel in 2005 to the number of rocket launches in 2006, they didn't decline. They increased by 500%. We can go into reasons why that occurred. I have a whole thesis on that subject. But it left Israelis with a sense, unilateralism? That will undermine our security. I think with the history of what happened in Gaza, and with the environment of, for lack of a better term, the Arab Spring, Israelis are today more cautious than they have been in the past. Less prone to experiment. And it will be up to the national leadership in Israel to prove that any breakthrough that Israel proposes in the peace process will leave Israel more secure rather than less secure. And that's not a simple matter to resolve. But that is something that will be demanded by the Israeli public, regardless of who's prime minister. And since I know the current prime minister, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he will insist on security as well. I'll stop here.
Perfect. You set a marvelous example. Thank you very much. Next, would you like to go next?
Sure. And I guess I'm not going to stand on the podium. I'm going to do it from here. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel with my colleagues. It's a pleasure to be back in the Harvard negotiation program. This is my second time in here. Great thanks to Shula again for organizing it. The first time I came here was in 2001, which was the first time that I was exposed to terms like ZOPA and BATNA and these terms. My only regret that it happened after the negotiations collapsed. It would have been very helpful to have had that exercise before we started negotiating. It would not have resolved the conflict, but would have given us maybe a more constructive negotiation atmosphere. Now, to be honest, between Professor Mnookin's introduction and Dennis Ross's op-ed, there's not much more that I can say. But I'll try to maybe repeat some of the themes and expand on them. And before I start on my core presentation, I just want to touch on the issue of second track exercises, which I've been involved in some. I, to be honest, never really took them that seriously. It was a way of just breaking out of Ramallah and going to a good hotel and maybe having a good conversation. Now, though, I have a different view. Now I think they are key, they are essential, they're very important, not in terms of producing results. I don't think anyone right now is interested in producing big results. But in terms of maintaining contacts, one very disturbing trend that I have been seeing is the lack of contacts between Palestinians and Israelis at all levels. At the social level, in the past, before the last 15 years, they knew one another, the two peoples. Many of the kind of stereotypes of Israelis that you had elsewhere in the Arab world did not exist among Palestinians. Almost a generation later, with no contact, you see some of the same problems that we have in the rest of the Arab world developing in the West Bank in terms of relations, and that is not a particularly healthy trajectory that I'm looking at. But nor do actually the top people, the negotiators, the leaders, the officials, they don't meet, except in very specific instances. And that creates the worst kind of assumptions and lack of trust, etc., that would lead us to very uncomfortable situations. So I'm actually right now of the view that the more the better. People need to interact, not only on a human level, but also in order to test some of the ideas that both sides are thinking about and to get a better sense of where the other side is. Now, I do believe personally that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict can only be resolved through negotiations. Ultimately, issues like Jerusalem, like refugees, like the final borders, permanent security arrangements, these are not things that you can do in any way except for negotiations. However, I come today with the following assumptions that basically inform my thinking. First of all, I don't think that a conflict ending agreement, a peace agreement, by the way, I'm not a big fan of the word peace. Peace comes with such connotations of, warm, fuzzy feelings. I talk about conflict ending arrangements and agreements. I look at it, the relation between Palestinians and Israelis as a divorce that requires us to identify the core issues and just move away from the fluff. And so I don't think this is the time, though, for any kind of conflict ending agreement for a number of reasons. And Bob, you started with describing some of them. I think the politics on both sides is not ready. I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but no matter how I do the math, I do not see an Israeli coalition that will be capable of reaching the kind of decisions that you need for a permanent deal on Jerusalem, etc. I see a coalition that will be interested in moving some, and I think that is a key factor that we have to keep in mind, but I don't see a coalition that can reach the big ones. What I'm an expert on, which is Palestinian politics, also tells me that we're not going to see a political moment where the leaders can actually reach a deal. You talked about the Hamas-Fatah split, which I agree with you, is not going to be resolved anytime soon, and that's good, by the way. I think you have two irreconcilable narratives. One of them will win, one will lose, and the winner will define the Palestinian future, and the loser might come in as a junior partner, but I don't see how you can reconcile the two. Nor do I see how you can reach reconciliation when Hamas continues to maintain its militias. So for me, I don't see it happening, and I'm glad that it's not happening. No artificial unity is happening. As importantly, and this is something that many do not actually pay much attention to, is what's happening in the West Bank itself. And I would say here three trends that I would look at. On the high politics, I would say we are seeing an interesting conflict between two approaches to both governance and foreign policy. An approach that's typified by the what we call the old guards, the Abus, the old PLO crowd that came from Tunis or who basically are of the same thinking. And those are basically doing business as usual. This is the mentality and the mindset that brought us to the UN which is a move that I understand where it's coming from in terms of expressing frustration, but I just don't understand in diplomatic terms or strategic terms. It baffles me. But it is that mentality, and it's the same mentality that continues to exercise corruption and what have you in Palestine itself, with implications to the whole legitimacy of the Palestinian governance. The other trend is a trend that is different. It's the most obvious face is Salam Fayyad, the prime minister, that basically is less interested in big flashy issues, but is interested on getting things done, both in domestic terms, in terms of creating clean, responsive government, issues that we suffered from in the 90s, but also vis-a-vis Israel, in terms of actually looking at the core issue that from the Palestinian side was the downfall of Oslo. Israel had its fair share of mistakes. I'm not going to talk about that. But at least from the Palestinian side, the lack of seriousness in which security was being approached, the way it was looked at as really as a political card, both in terms of giving out favors in domestic terms, but also in terms of applying pressure on Israel on given terms, which led us to the Intifada and to many other catastrophes in recent Palestinian history. You have this prime minister that says, this is not a joke. I am serious about my security work. Many of us, myself included, did not think that he's going to make it, succeed. Today, I'm glad to say that, in my view, the IDF, counterintuitively, has become the Palestinians' biggest advocate in the Israeli system. But you have, these are two conflicting trends of governance, and frankly, a lot of the Palestinian politics and behavior that you see is shaped by this tension. And thirdly, if you move away from the high politics, you get to the public. And the public right now, and I've heard the variations on the following from many Palestinian non-officials that I talk to, would tell you that they would tell you, we have tried everything and nothing worked. We negotiated, nothing came out of it. The Intifada, nothing came out of it. Went to the UN, nice gesture, nothing is coming out of it. We did the institution building and the security cooperation, nothing is coming out of it. So what you end up with is a degree of frustration that often translates into lack of faith in leaderships, which often translates into lack of faith in governing structures. So my first assumption is, given all of this, the polity is not ready. The Palestinian polity is not ready, nor is the Israeli polity. If you look at the region, we've talked enough about it. There's so much uncertainty, you're not going to throw yet another variable into the equation. If you look at the US, it's clear that the president has other priorities. And I believe that the kind of conflict ending agreement, to get there, you would need presidential engagement at a given point, and we're not going to have it. You look at the caliber of the leaders. We are no longer in the era of the transformative leaders. We're not in the era of Sharon, who would look at the Israeli political system, has something in mind, but look at the system, he sees it doesn't bear it, so he goes and changes the system. We're not at the time of Anwar Sadat, who can do what Anwar Sadat, where a leader can just show up in the Knesset and overnight shift the whole dynamic. We're not there. We're at the era of risk-averse leaders who should be approached in the way that we approach any other politician anywhere else in the world. So all of this tells me that there is not going to be a peace deal. On the other hand, the other assumption that I have is that the situation on the ground, at least in the West Bank, is extremely explosive. I mentioned the lack of faith among the Palestinians of anything, of the leaderships and all of the existing political tracks. There is, in addition to the lack of leadership, of the faith in leadership, the fact that the economic situation is abysmal in the PA. Civil servants have not been paid for months. So what you have is a very explosive situation. We are just getting out of what could have been, in my view, an explosive episode that could have spiraled out of control, a series of clashes and protests that could have spiraled out of control. We survived this one, I hope, but many will come if we don't do anything. So in my view, there is no peace deal, yet the status quo is explosive and could lead us to very short-term, disruptive, out-of-control kind of scenarios. So the question becomes, or in my view, the space that we can start to look into in the coming short to medium term, let's say for the sake of argument the next couple of years, is the space between not doing anything but not doing the big thing, the whole thing. something in between. Now, there are many things that can be done, and I think if you look at Dennis Ross's op-ed, it will give you a flavor of what kind of category of things that need to be done. In my view, the question now is what we can do and how we should do it. And the what, I would say, falls into two categories. The first and most pressing priority, in my mind, is to stop further erosion. Further erosion of the situation and the stability in the West Bank, further erosion in terms of faith in diplomacy and peaceful means. And to that, I would say two core issues need to be preserved. Two core dynamics need to be preserved. The one is preserving the PA. This is not the Palestinian Authority. This is not only a Palestinian interest. I think this is an Israeli interest. A vacuum in the West Bank is not in Israel's interest, and definitely not in Jordan's interest. Jordan has enough fragility as it stands now. We don't need another front opened for Jordan. And the core issue, in my view, in preserving the PA is ensuring that at least they continue to be able to pay salaries. And as such, from my perspective at least, we need to insulate the issue of tax revenue transfers from Israel to the Palestinian Authority from political means, from political ups and downs. I mean, I understand the Israeli desire to punish the Palestinians, quote unquote, after the UN deal, and there are many ways that Israel can do that. But I think hitting this one issue is, on the one hand, of course, punishing the part of the PA that's been trying to cooperate with Israel, but on the other hand also is endangering the actual PA. The second issue and the second track that needs to be preserved away from any political interference from the ups and downs is security cooperation. Because without the security cooperation that we see right now, without stability in the West Bank in particular, and without the relations between the IDF and the Palestinian security establishment, nothing can be done. Nothing. No matter what's done will be reversed the next terrorist attack. So that needs to be continued. So this is what I would say we need to do in terms of preserving the situation, in terms of stopping further erosion. But there are things that we also need to, in order to advance the state of affairs. And here, this is where I would disagree with you, Dore. I think there is a space for unilateralism. In terms of, look, I mean, the situation right now, the Palestinians' main concern is that the current configuration with the Palestinians basically stuck in areas A, in urban areas, the difficulty of moving, the difficulty of economically expanding beyond that is, in my view, on the one hand, one of the main economic issues, but also it is an indication, an ongoing indication that Israel has no interest in de-occupying. So I believe that if we can, based on security calculations, unlike Gaza, which was based on a political calculation by Sharon, understandable, but this is based on security considerations, to start a series of unilateral steps, not unilateral steps that will lead us to anything significant, 60, 70, 80% of the West Bank. That is too much, politically too much. This will create pushback from among the Palestinians, who will see the permanent or the interim becoming permanent. This will create pushback, I assume, in Israel with the memories of Gaza and Lebanon coming in. But small ones, security-led, that will create a sense of progress, a sense of moving forward, that will allow people like Fayyad to say that working closely with the Israelis produces political dividend, not only economic.
I want to thank you because I think you've made some wonderful points.
But just one last point
Please.
that I would add. It's actually only been around 10 minutes. The reason why I don't think that negotiation right now is the way to go forward, I would love to see that being negotiated. The reason why I don't think the negotiations is the way to go forward, because negotiations sometimes become in themselves a politically costly issue with that brings with it political baggage and political cost. That's one. So right now, sitting to negotiations is in itself an exercise that would require American mediation and expenditure of political capital, etc., etc. I'm not sure it's worth it. And secondly, I do not see right now any political interest and political dividend coming to either side from signing, or at least to the Palestinians, that's what I can speak for, in signing something that is partial. Sometimes when you are negotiating, you get a good offer that you have to say no to because it is not the perfect offer. If we leave this issue of moving things on the ground to a negotiated process, then this becomes a political football. And either side withhold progress on the hope of getting something bigger in the next move. So I think this is not time for negotiation, definitely not in terms of getting the big deal, nor is it time, I think, for even the process of negotiation. This is the time to start looking for a unilateral, limited series of steps that, while unilateral, of course, there will be coordination. The Palestinians cannot say no to that. And the Israelis will not be pushed in this regard to do anything that goes outside their comfort zone. Definitely, we're not talking about hilltops. We're not talking about the Jordan Valley, but enough to show that there is a virtuous dynamic. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. That's terrific. Ambassador Baker.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try and be somewhat more optimistic. And let me open by saying that I don't necessarily accept the assumption for this discussion that the negotiating, the direct negotiating mode is indefinitely at an end or lost or stunted. I don't accept that, and most of my experience negotiating, and I would have given you the list, but I haven't got the time, but there are over 50 to 60 distinct negotiating sessions that I've taken part in, whether with the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the UN, the Americans, and the Russians and others. And on the basis of all these negotiating experiences, I still feel that the only way to progress between the Israelis and the Palestinians can only be through direct negotiations. Any other way, whether it's by going to the United Nations and trying to bring about an imposed solution, which Abu Mazen did a couple of months ago, it might well have been a great PR stunt for him, but it certainly didn't establish a Palestinian state, and it didn't move the process one iota towards any type of solution. And similarly, third-party involvement, like the EU or the UN, there's no chance that any of them can come along and impose a solution for several reasons. First of all, because there's a perception of bias, especially in the EU, not to mention, of course, the United Nations, and even some type of aggressive intervention by the United States, whether this is what President Obama intends to do or not in a couple of weeks' time, in my opinion, also would probably counter any possibility of moving forward. But, and here I think that the concept of Batna or finding islands of cooperation as alternative means when the main channel is perhaps limited or blocked for a certain amount of time, this is possible. And I think there are several fields that we can and we should move forward in. One of them, of course, is water. Water doesn't recognize boundaries, and the water that falls on the hills of Judea and Samaria, if it falls on one side, it goes down towards the Dead Sea, and nobody enjoys it. And if it falls on the other side, it flows across the land and enters into the under the land and goes towards the Mediterranean Sea. So we all have to enjoy it, and we all have to cooperate in administering it. And this is one of the vital issues that both the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Jordanians have to do, because we haven't got water. And when I was ambassador in Canada and tried to plead to the Canadians who've got more water than they can deal with, send us water, we'll buy it, and they refused. So this was an abject failure on my part. Another field is tourism and economic cooperation. There's an old airport in Jerusalem. If you can imagine opening up this airport for pilgrims, Christian, Muslim, and Jews to come and turn this into a joint project, this would have a huge economic impact on the whole area, which could be shared by everybody. Ghaith mentioned security cooperation. This is perhaps, I agree, this is the most important because it requires this cooperation to face threats that are coming outside, threats against both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And then all sorts of other mutual confidence measures to build up bon voisinage between the two peoples, people-to-people gestures and negotiations, which were initially envisaged in the Oslo agreements and led by the Norwegians, very, very important elements that, as was said by Guy, there's no longer any personal contact between officials of the two sides, between the ordinary public of the two sides, which limits the possibility of such acts of bon voisinage. Now, in my experience of negotiating, I think that there are several of the accepted negotiating theories, some of which emanate from here, from Harvard, that are quite relevant. I think this whole aim of having to understand the aims of the other side and to try and help achieve these aims through mutual understanding rather than through adversarial style. This is something very important, and the theories of Michael Alvarez and Julia Matloff Kennedy, quote, to understand and shape your counterpart's perceived decisions so that he chooses it in his own interest. Or Fisher and Urey, the whole concept of Batna, focusing on interests, on material gains for both sides. Or the Nash equilibrium, John Forbes Nash, quote, each player considers the other's decisions. And several other possibilities, Brad Spangler, Zoppa, requiring mutual consideration of the other's interests. And so this has been and should be the very basis of the relationship, the negotiating relationship, in a special circumstance such as the one that we have. But the classical Batna and Zoppa theories, which might well be relevant to business negotiations or negotiations between normal, rational parties, they're not necessarily relevant to Middle East peace negotiations. And they may be confusing and inapplicable, and they certainly wouldn't meet the sui generis, emotional, religious, psychological, biblical, and volatile nature of the Middle East negotiations and the parties, and the realities, the leaderships, the populations, and the cultures. First of all, there are some basic differences between this and normal negotiation. We're not talking about negotiation between two sovereign states like we had between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon. This was plain standard negotiation between two sovereign entities. There are rules, there's the UN Charter, you make peace, everybody knows, it's very well defined what this is. Here we're talking about peace between a sovereign state and a non-state entity, which is far more complex. Agreements signed between Israel and the PLO, the whole series of Oslo agreements, are sui generis agreements. They're not international treaties in accordance with the laws of treaties. Any future treaty between Israel and the Palestinians, in actual fact, will be composed of two elements. First of all, reaching a set of agreements that will bring about a situation in which they'll become or they'll emerge a Palestinian state, and then once there is such a state, some type of mutual agreement between the two states on peace between them and living together. As I said, some of the sources of or guidelines for agreements between the two parties would inevitably be major UN resolutions, Security Council resolutions 242, 338, calling for international boundaries, withdrawal from certain territories. But the annual ritual General Assembly resolutions in the UN guided by bloc politics, they can't serve as a basis for negotiation, other than being utilized by the one side simply to push their own negotiating position. And which, as I said, the recent upgrade resolution really didn't add anything to this situation. Now, perhaps afterwards, in question time, I'll go into the individual issues between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but on the basis of my experience negotiating, I'll end up by giving you a series of principles or sort of code of negotiating conduct between the two that I think has become acceptable to both sides. First of all, both sides have to acknowledge the negotiating culture of the other side. Thank you. Thank you.
Why don't you carry on for a couple minutes?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, understanding the concept of written commitment in Islam, which differs from accepted international concepts of binding commitment. Understanding body language and sensitivities. We went through a whole course before we got into negotiations with the Palestinians on what you should do and what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't show your foot, and things like that. These are very important and very sensitive. Past history, education, prejudices, fears, suspicions regarding Jews and Israelis on the one hand, and Arabs and Muslims on the other. This has to be understood and has to be studied. Personal experience of negotiators. One of the negotiators, Jibril Rajoub, spent 7 years in an Israeli prison. He learnt Hebrew better than I know Hebrew, but it was very important to be able to cooperate with him, understanding his own experiences. Limitations on authority to negotiate. In many cases, it was very difficult negotiating because our bosses wouldn't let us move forward without going back to them and getting their permission. And in many cases, we found ourselves agreeing among ourselves. If you help me explain this to Arafat, then I'll help you explain this to Perez and Rabin. And so basically what I define this as horse trading. In other words, we were both helping each other ensure that our mutual bosses would understand what we're talking about and accept the formulations. And this in itself also enabled us, after the agreement, to be able to work together in interpreting the agreements and in understanding and persuading our own people. So there are various basic fields that are special to Middle East negotiations that don't exist in other normal negotiations, and these can only be, in order to succeed in any negotiation, any future negotiation, these elements have to come back, and we have to restore them, and we have to get back to this type of mode of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we get to questions, I'd just like to make a couple observations as a negotiation analyst. First, my introduction was not meant to say there couldn't be islands of agreement or initiatives on each side that wouldn't be constructive and consistent with the possibility of something I very much believe in, and that is the possibility, ultimately, of a negotiated two-state resolution. I know not everyone on both sides believes in that, and that's part of the reality. That's because that makes the conflicts behind the table more difficult. Second, you're quite right that a core of our teaching here, and I think everybody who teaches about negotiation, is how indispensable it is to try to be able to see the world through the other person's eyes in a way that doesn't demonize them necessarily, but really tries to understand what their perspective is. And I think all of our panelists have that capacity. Third, and this is at the core of much of our teaching, in any negotiation, there are always distributive issues where more for you may mean less for me. But in most negotiations, there are opportunities to expand the pie as well, to create value. And one of the challenges in any situation is how, in fact, can you work together to expand the pie, whether it's to create more tourism, greater security on both sides. It's so clear that in all sorts of ways, if the economy in the region would improve, it's good for Israelis and it's good for Palestinians. If the security for ordinary people on the ground would improve, it's good for both. It's not just good for one or the other. On the other hand, there are other issues relating to territory where there's a conflict, okay? Where more for one may mean less for the other. And the challenge of how you manage that tension is something that's the core of our teaching here, okay? So I want to suggest that, in fact, I don't, in defense of those of us who study negotiation, I don't think we're so naive to think there's, win-win, we're going to all be arm in arm singing Kumbaya. To the contrary, and this really builds on something that was said. In my view, peace is not an outcome, it's a process. Peace has to do by what process with someone when you're in conflict do you resolve those conflicts? And how do you transform a relationship so that, in fact, inevitably there are going to be conflicts? This is all so complicated, that in any kind of implementation there are going to be conflicts. How do you work so that you can resolve it without violence, or to minimize violence, and diminish the capacity of spoilers on both sides to disrupt it? Because let me tell you something, the thing that's clear is there are spoilers on both sides. And anyone who says there aren't doesn't understand the conflict. There are Palestinians who genuinely reject 48. They don't want to implement 67. They want to roll it back further. There are also Israelis who believe that for a combination of religious and nationalistic reasons, Judea and Samaria belong to the Jewish people. And a two-state solution is something they don't want. Now, that's part of this reality. And that's sort of what we got to deal with. That's the end of my spiel. Now, I guess what I really ask, because I think there are a lot of extremely interesting things said. First question I'd like to ask is, I want to give the Netanyahu government credit for something for which they rarely claim credit, and they're given no international credit. And that is, I think most Americans, and certainly most Europeans, have no sense that during the last 3 or 4 years, the number of checkpoints and the heavy-handedness of security arrangements in the West Bank has diminished substantially on the ground. Paradoxically, the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to give much credit to Netanyahu's government for that, and Netanyahu's government so were interested, maybe, and this may be wrong, I'm not knowledgeable enough, but in terms of coalition politics, they don't too much want to claim credit for it. The second thing is Fayed has done some remarkable things. And I guess the question I'd have for you is, and it really relates to Gaza too, because some of us have been studying the lessons of Gaza. Why isn't there more of an attempt on the part of the Israeli government to help the moderates on the Palestinian side in terms of economic development, in terms of paying civil servants, in terms of extending security arrangements? Is it because of internal politics? But it strikes me. Jim Sebanius and I were at a meeting some months ago in Washington where people were kind of horrified by what was going on because of the request to the UN in terms of withholding funds, where not that Israel should say, oh, we're going to acquiesce in a declaration of Palestinian statehood, but why, in fact, do you take actions that subvert? I'll give you a second example. This is a more controversial one. And that is with the prisoner exchange. Who got credit for the prisoner exchange? Hamas. And I understand the internal pressures within Israel to do it, but it struck me as so insensitive to what's going on behind the table on the other side. And the same can be true for Palestinian actions of various sorts. I don't mean just to pick on the Israelis, but why don't leaders on each side who in fact are willing to contemplate ultimately having a two-state solution, being more sensitive to the impact of their actions on the internal dynamics on the other side?
Well, I'll give you perhaps even another rule of thumb that builds on what you're trying to say, I think. I think if you want to be a really effective negotiating partner, you have to come up with proposals that aren't intended to undermine the standing of the other side or undermining the standing of the other side in the eyes of his own public. Normally, part of this negotiation is like a duel, and you don't always take that into account. It would be easy for us to come up with proposals that we would want Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen to implement. But we have to understand there's certain things he cannot implement, just like they have to understand there's certain things that the Israeli side can't implement. I think Ghaith already pointed to it when he spoke about the Jordan Valley. He already took into account an Israeli position in his own presentation. You know, if I can go back for a minute to this Balin Abu Mazen agreement that was never an agreement. I understand how that was worked out, and it was very, very interesting. Because at least in the effort to make it work, they took into account Rabin's red lines. They said, Rabin said not going back to the 67 borders, not dividing Jerusalem. And the Palestinian negotiators tried to work that in. Again, they didn't reach a final agreement, but I think the key point that I guess I want to stress is it's important that when we come up with negotiating proposals, we do things which strengthen the other side and not weaken it. And the same is true on their part.
So you agree with my proposition?
I agree with the fundamental proposition. That's what we have to do. I have another issue.
No, but
but connected to this.
Sure.
I sometimes hear Palestinians who say to me, you know, people say, "Oh, we have to figure out a way to strengthen Abu Mazen." This is going to sound like a contradiction. And Palestinians say to me many times, "Another one of your theories of how to strengthen Abu Mazen, you're going to end up making him even weaker." But I'm just saying that sometimes these programs that they put forward don't work. But in our negotiating proposals, he has to come out, he or whoever replaces him in the future has to come out stronger. And the same is true when they approach the government of Israel.
If I may just comment a couple of things. I mean, why do leaders keep on saying nasty things? Frankly, because it politically pays.
Of course.
And there is no political cost to saying things of this sort.
No internal political.
No political cost, internal or otherwise, and that is worth looking into. How do you create a system of incentive and disincentive, to the extent possible, to minimize some of the most damaging kinds of public statements? I mean, and we can identify even what these are for both sides. In terms of
let me just say footnote to that, though. There are costs because of the impact of those statements on the public on the other side.
Yeah.
There's no acoustic separation. There are Israelis who are translating what's being said in Arabic and vice versa.
More than that, there is cost. I mean, if you want to be strategic, there's cost to your own society, because if you want to compromise in the long term, you don't want to condition your public to be against it at the end game. But that's on one point. By the way, keeping with recognizing, giving credit where credit is due, interestingly, despite, by the way, Israel withholding the tax revenues, which was a very political issue at a very political time, I mean, official Israel as well as the pro-Israel community was very active in Washington in the meantime, trying to convince Congress, along with many of us, to actually release the money.
That's right.
Because there's an understanding here of self-interest. But in terms, though, of helping the other side, I think we often, and this is a mistake that both sides do, assume that the other is a monolith and have very little sense of timing and how certain actions are perceived. I look again at the issue of the tax revenues. They were withheld after the UN trip, whatever you want to call it. When were they released? When the Palestinians started demonstrating last week in the West Bank, and it was released out of panic. What is the received message here? The received message is Israel understands tension. Gaza, the way it was done, and the way it was, how was it perceived as Israel was afraid of Hamas's missile? So sometimes, in terms of presenting the timing and the spin are as important as the action itself. Ultimately, this is not technical. This is political. It's a question of looking at what do you politically need most from the other side that it can deliver, and how it can deliver it, and vice versa, without pushing for too much, breaking the other side or forcing the other side to go to its corner, but without also being a situation where, frankly, the bad guys get the benefit and those who are cooperating end up with nothing.
It's very short. Look, it takes two to make gestures. It's not a one-sided thing, and when one comes and says, well, you must find a way of buttressing or helping Abu Mazen, it's not one, it's the one way.
By the way, I didn't say Abu Mazen.
Neither did I.
I said moderates on the other side.
But, you know,
I guess I most of all would like to buttress Fayed.
if Abu Mazen is considered and is considered by the international community as a moderate, then this morning when he accused Israel of ethnic cleansing, or every other day that he institutes or threatens to institute prosecutions against Israeli officials and army officers, or instituting actions in UN specialized agencies, denying, for instance, the Jewish nature of a Jewish tomb or a Jewish holy place, or Saib Arikat's daily insulting the Israeli Prime Minister and the leaders of the Israeli negotiating team. These aren't things that can bring about reciprocal confidence-building measures on the other side. So there should be, in my opinion, a code of conduct that there are things that you don't do if you genuinely intend to negotiate with the other side or achieve peace with the other side, and you genuinely want to attract the support of the other side's public. You don't alienate that public by insulting or by carrying out acts of delegitimization.
By the way, that's why last week me and a colleague of mine wrote that op-ed in the Washington Post to specifically deal with some of these issues, whether it's the issue of delegitimization, denying the Jewish link, or some of the Israeli statements and behavior that are read in a similar way on the Palestinian side. I agree with you here.
Do you have questions for each other in light of presentations?
I have a question for
Sure.
Ghaith. You said something very interesting, that you don't think the issue is peace. The issue is ending conflict, some type of divorce. Well, first of all, we're not married yet. So it will be difficult to get onto a divorce, and I think we can't allow ourselves to underestimate or weaken the concept of peace. It's a concept that is so deeply ensconced in the psyche of international relationships, that this is what has to be, and this is what we've achieved with the Egyptians. You can say that it's a good peace, or it's not a good peace, or a strong peace, or a weak peace. This is what we have with the Jordanians, which is considerably more solid. And this is what we all seek with the Palestinians, and I don't think we should deny ourselves this. Peace has got definitions in international law, in international practice, and we should aim at achieving, to the greatest possible extent, fulfillment of these definitions.
Okay, I mean, the reason why I don't like the word peace is not the international law definition of peace, but the public, whenever I talk about peace here, you see people getting this kind of dreamy look in their eyes. And why do I? I mean, first of all, actually, okay, let me start with the marriage or divorce. Maybe we're not married, but it's definitely an abusive relationship where both sides are hurting one another, okay? And look, I mean, my own journey...
You should go to a marriage counselor.
Or a divorce lawyer. Look, I mean, my own, and again, since we're on this metaphor, I'll continue with it a little bit. When I first joined the negotiation process, I really used to think of peace as a marriage, as a flirtation. I don't know, when you're flirting towards marriage, you want to know what they love, what the other side love, and what's their favorite color, and the name of their first pet, and blah, blah, blah. So what we ended up doing was two things: overloading the process by adding things on the process that were not core, not important to the core interests of both sides. And often we found ourselves being held back by these issues on the side. I mean, I remember clearly the Camp David versus the whatever it's town outside Camp David. We were having two sets of negotiations, and you're using one against the other to stall it. So that's one. And secondly, we ended up, because of the sense of peace as warmth, we ended up negotiating or trying to negotiate the unnegotiable. I will never forget in Taba being asked by my boss to go with my Israeli counterpart to go and negotiate and draft a joint narrative of what happened in 1948. Seriously? You call it the year, what is it, the War of Liberation, the year the diaspora ended, the homeland was established. We call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. It was a bad year for me, it was a good year for you. And in a sense, we ended up adding all of these things. Right now, I look at it as I said, in a divorce it's very clear. You know, you get the kids, I get the electronics, and we move on. You whittle it down to its core, the core interest. Now, I think with this, you need two processes that will be parallel to it. One is a process of sensitization. I think, while I don't think that you can negotiate history and narrative, I think it is key that one side understands the narrative of the other, and more importantly, understand that you hold that view because of conviction, not malice. When I first heard an Israeli narrative, it was my whole being was telling me, you are trying to undermine my narrative. It took me years of sitting with my Israeli friends, and many of them have become friends, to understand actually, oh no, you actually believe what you're saying. And we need to have that kind of a process, because ultimately this is what's going to deal with some of these issues. But bottom line, as much as the peace between Israel and Egypt is not what I have aspired to when I first joined the process, I'm more than comfortable with it. It is cold, it is not warm, etc., but it is stable. And for me, I would look this as the first step, and all of the other trappings are things that might or might not follow. I would like them to follow, but I can live if they don't.
Excuse me. There is a factor that we have not brought up in our discussions, and that's the role of the wider Arab context. It used to be called the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as though we're on some island in the Indian Ocean and the rest is just background noise. But I think the wider Arab world can be very important in bringing about a different mode of relations between us. I'll tell you a story. A member of the Palestinian Security Services came to my office about, I would say, 6-7 years ago. And he said, you know, when the Americans leave Iraq, the front line between the Shiites and the Sunnis will be the Jordanian-Iraqi border, because Iraq will go to the Iranians. And he was then, and this is, remember, this is Palestinian Security Services, he was suggesting a need for greater security coordination between the Palestinians and the Jordanians. That was his conclusion, which I found, first of all, fascinating, creative thinking. Now, when Mubarak was ousted, I immediately saw that the Palestinians had lost, or Abu Mazen in particular had lost, his great regional backer, the man he would go to help resolve differences and get support from. And then now you see, sort of instead of Mubarak, you see the Palestinian leadership going more to Jordan, having meetings and negotiations in Jordan. Now, Israelis talking about Jordan gets everybody very nervous, so I don't want to press the point too far. But there is something, when you want to structure a more successful negotiation, about having neighboring state involvement in creating that negotiation. You know, you had a negotiation over what would happen with Bosnia. If you confined it only to Bosnia, without and left Serbia out of it, then Holbrooke could never have reached a Dayton agreement. You had to have a kind of wider support for that agreement in that conflict. Look at Northern Ireland. You know, the breakthrough that leads to the Good Friday Agreement could only happen when you had the Irish Republic working together with the United Kingdom to create some kind of framework, basically, for the parties in Northern Ireland to come together. So I believe that this we haven't addressed really, but I think it's a key element to moving forward, whether we're going to go through gradualism, some kind of unilateralism, or through a direct negotiation.
By the way, this is true on two tracks. One track is Arab support to the Palestinians, and not only financial but also political. That is key. But the other one is how do they support the process as a whole? And there's something called the Arab Peace Initiative that came from a Beirut summit that talks about you get peace, you end the occupation, and you get full recognition and what have you. The problem with this, it's always been approached as an all or nothing proposal. Once you have the full peace, then you have the full. So everything is front loaded, and back loaded. And as we know in the Middle East, if it's all or nothing, it's more often than not nothing. And I would be very interested in looking at ways in which you can do a set of gradual implementation of the Arab Peace Initiative. Israel does something partial, the Arabs do something partial in return. Israel does something reversible, the Arabs do something reversible in return. Israel does something big, the Arabs do something big. So take it from an all or nothing. And this, by the way, requires very creative and sometimes very tough American diplomacy, because you need someone coordinating this whole very complicated architecture that we need to push things in the right direction.
Let us now open it up to questions. And what I very much appreciate is use the microphone, and I'd prefer questions to statements. Are there questions? Yes, sir. Here, let us get you the microphone. People identify themselves. Would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Philippe Aguillon. I'm a professor in the economics department here at Harvard.
Welcome. Nice to have you at the law school.
So, in the theory of in the way economists approach negotiation and bargaining, there is the cost of waiting, and so sometimes what happens is that if you wait, the cake shrinks. That might be an inducement to speed up negotiation, but sometimes it may make negotiation, impossible, difficult. And here, for example, the feeling that some countries have, and is that short-run politics, for example, in Israel, what you call coalition politics, is that the case, may lead to unilateral steps. We think of settlements, building or other things, maybe that's wrong, that might make a two-state solution very quickly difficult to implement. I even saw Tipi Livni, a few months ago here saying, time is running out. We very soon will be in a situation where the two-state solution is no longer feasible. So sometimes this can speed up. So
exactly. I'd like to make that into a question. It's a very interesting observation. Do each of you view a two-state solution where there are two viable states still feasible, or are you among the increasing numbers who feel that, in fact, it's already too late?
Do I see it's feasible? I see it's feasible. Do I see it's under threat? Absolutely. My concern is frankly less, and this might not make me very popular with many in the pro-Palestinian community. My concern with the settlements is not logistical. With the whole idea of land swap, a 0.5% here at 0.1% there is something that you can absorb. It is more political. In the same way that issues of incitement and violence are the things that get Israelis convinced the Palestinians don't want peace, the settlement project is what gets Palestinians convinced that the Israelis don't want peace. And you can drive all the arguments you want to drive. This is the conviction right now. So what I see is the threat is not the physical, and by the way, it's not only the settlement, other issues there. People are starting to lose faith in the solution. Right now, if you look at opinion polls in Israel and Palestine, I can only speak about Palestine here, you see the majority of the Palestinians say the preferable is a two-state solution. You ask them the second question. Do you think the Israelis want it? They say, oh, no. So the majority says we want a two-state solution. The majority says the Israelis don't want it. And the conclusion is, therefore, it's not doable. At some point, the distance between the desirable and the possible becomes so far that you abandon the desirable. And this is, I'm afraid, we're in that zone. Now, one last comment, though, here is, why do I still push for a two-state solution? And frankly, the odds are against us. And if history is anything to prove, we're not going in that direction. Because I do not see any other option. The other option is the continuation of a conflict in one form or another. That to me is just not an option that I'm willing to entertain. Right now, the idea of a one state, which is popular on some campuses, it's a pipe dream. It is, the two political ethnic nationalisms cannot be simply dissolved into this new creation. And therefore, there is no option as far as I'm concerned. The question is, you don't want to do it too fast and really close the window. I don't think you can wait too long, but you want to enlarge the window. This is, I think, enlarging the cake is the point that we should be thinking about right now. For me, this is what you need to stabilize at the moment.
Two-state solution?
Well, I still believe that Israel should withdraw from parts of the West Bank while it retains what it calls its right for defensible borders. I think the structure of the final solution that emerges will combine federal and confederal elements with three states: Jordan, the Palestinian state, and the state of Israel. We will find that we have levels of mutual dependence that don't allow us to completely disengage from each other. Israel is about to come online with huge energy resources in the Mediterranean, which will help with desalination, which will help with things, frankly, that both the Palestinians need and the Jordanians need, and vice versa. Today, for example, the main, I would call metropolitan center of the West Bank is not Ramallah. It's not East Jerusalem, it's Amman. That's where you go when you want to have a political discussion. That's where you go when you want specialized doctors. That's where you go to fly out, to fly out to the whole world. You don't go to Ben Gurion Airport. So, there are elements and patterns of interaction between the three entities that exist today, which will have to become part of the political solution.
Do you think there can be still a contiguous Palestinian state? I know that a dream, I've done a lot of work with the internal conflict within Israel between those who are fervent believers in the settlement movement and those who aren't, all right? The belief of many national religious settlers is that there is a Palestinian state, we call it Jordan. And it should be Jordan. I mean, you gave a wonderful example about how in making the peace treaty with Jordan, you gave assurances to Jordan that no, that's not
the alternative.
The alternative. And I guess the question is, do you think it's still feasible to have a contiguous Palestinian state as part of a two-state resolution that provides for Israeli security?
Yes, I think we can have a contiguous Palestinian state, but I think the ultimate picture of what all this is going to look like will look very different from our political discourse today.
Fair enough.
And that's what I want to stress. And normally we also use another expression, not just two states. We say two states for two peoples.
Right.
Because as Israel has been asked to recognize the legitimacy of the Palestinian national movement, we are saying to the Palestinians, you must recognize the rights of the Jewish people to a nation state of their own. So that's another sort of addition that I have to put in when we speak about, the two-state solution. Well, wait a minute, there is an Israeli state, but we have to incorporate this other element as well. But ultimately, the picture of what might emerge between the Iraqi border and the Mediterranean is going to look a lot different than the political verbiage of our debates today in this particular decade of the 21st century.
And what's your perception?
I would say absolutely there will be a two-state solution. I don't think there's any other alternative, and I don't think time going by will weaken that or prevent it or lessen it. I don't see the settlement issue as something negative. It's an issue that is on the negotiating table, that Israel has agreed to negotiate with the Palestinians, and it will be negotiated, and the outcome will be something that will be, as any negotiation, as we very well know in this school, something that won't be black or white, but it will be grey. There'll be elements of compromise by both sides, but this will be the ultimate two-state solution. And so I don't see that there's any danger in time going by because of various reasons that this will prevent a resumption of negotiation and reaching agreement ultimately.
Well, the first, in Dennis Roth's op-ed, the first unilateral initiative that he suggests for Israel is on its own, not promising that it will necessarily last forever, stop the expansion of settlements beyond places where you anticipate, if there were a land swap, they'd be part of Israel. And many of us would think that would be a hugely constructive step. What are your thoughts about that? You're not speaking for Mr. Netanyahu.
Now, I personally think the settlement issue is overstated, and it has created a kind of cottage industry of geographers who are saying, how can you squeeze the maximal number of settlers into the minimal amount of territory? It's almost like how many settlers can you fit on the head of a pin? And I think there are other issues between us and the Palestinians that are much more profound. You know, there actually was a fascinating piece in the New York Times Magazine about 2 years ago by Bernard Avishai. And it was based on an interview he had with Abu Mazen. And in the interview, Abu Mazen put forward the claim that if you take all the built-up areas of the settlements, and by the way, I think Abu Mazen got his numbers wrong. Never mind, this is what he said, and that's what's important. So if you take the whole built-up areas of all the settlements, territory comes to 1.2% of the West Bank. And then he said, and I offered Olmert a 1.8% of the West Bank in a land swap. So I offered him more than he needs for his settlements. But Israel's, if you go into its defensible borders, its security requirements, they're much different than just the layout of the settlements. There are issues like airspace control over the West Bank, so you can have an air defense of the area. There's the issue of the territory dominating Ben Gurion Airport, where there are only very few settlements. So I don't like to put the whole focus on settlements.
I don't think it should be the whole focus, but I guess
that
the
has
question
become,
is,
if you read, let's say, editorial opinion in the United States, you'd think that Israel's poured concrete on every square inch from the Jordan River to the old Green Line. And it's not the real issue. And even Abu Mazen says it, although he would never, make a public declaration of it. It just happened to come out that way.
From my perspective right now, I would love to see a settlement freeze. I strongly believe that settlements are problematic, but I also understand that right now this is something that we will not agree on. Just like if you and I are going to talk, or the three of us are going to talk about Jerusalem, we're not going to agree. And the beauty and the tragedy, I guess, of the situation is we don't need to deal with many of these issues right now. There are pressing issues that can and need to be done. Yeah. Rather than emphasizing the differences, which somehow, whenever you talk about Palestinians and Israelis, you emphasize the differences. This is where we end up in our conversation. There's a lot of space of things that can be done, which might not be, the stuff that will create New York Times op-eds. But it's definitely the kind of stuff that will change people's perception on the ground. And by the way, this is one thing that we have often ignored. We've often looked a lot to the political classes and what they are worried about and what have you. And we forgot that there's a public that is very, respondent to concrete proposals and changes. During the Gaza disengagement, I was in Gaza. And those of us who were officials and what have you, we were dead bent against it. We were like, no, this is bad, blah, blah, blah. People in Gaza were just you can't wait for it to happen because they felt their lives are going to change. And I think in some ways, moving away from the big issues, we have to get back to them. At some point we have to get back to them. We have to sit down and fight it over. Right now, the priorities and the urgencies lie elsewhere. And rather than waste political capital, political space, political time, let's do what is doable that will create for you the credit that you can then go and spend on some of these bigger issues.
And I gather in your view, those are security issues and economic development issues.
Security, economic development, and preserving the institutions of the PA. I'm sure Israel, the Israelis, when they think they have their own issues and concerns. And by the way, if you come to a point where you don't agree on, move on. We have a huge menu of other issues that we can deal. We're not looking at a comprehensive agreement that will cover every possible component.
Well, we've run out of time, and on that somewhat optimistic note, because I think there's really agreement amongst the three of them on that issue. I hope you'll join me in thanking our three panelists.